The wind rattled the loose window panes of Everbrook Elementary, an aging school tucked beneath the hills of a quiet American town. The hallway tiles were cracked, the desks uneven. But inside room 6B stood Miss Adeline Moore, a humble woman with tired eyes and a heart full of silent endurance. The children loved her, not for her worn clothes or tattered shoes, but for how she saw potential in those no one else even noticed. Adeline had no family, no fame, and certainly no fortune. What she had was a calling, to teach, to protect, to uplift. But that Tuesday morning changed everything. The school had planned an event, a charity visit from Senator Brooks Callahan, the man whose name adorned the library plaque, but whose presence had never graced the campus in person until now. He arrived in a tailored navy blue suit, cameras trailing him like moths to a flame. News crews hovered like vultures, capturing every handshake, every photo op smile. But it was when he walked into Miss Adeline's class that the illusion cracked. She hadn't planned to speak to him. She was content watching from the corner, arms folded with pride as her students read poems they'd written for the senator's visit. But then the boy, little Caleb, ran up to him with too much excitement and accidentally spilled juice across his polished shoes. The room fell silent. The senator's smile faded. In one sharp, sudden movement, he slapped Caleb across the cheek. Gasps filled the air. The cameraman stuttered. The children froze. But Miss Adeline, her instincts, sharpened by years of protecting the innocent, stepped between them without hesitation. Her voice didn't rise. Her hands didn't tremble. She simply placed herself in front of the boy, shielding him with her body. The senator's hand struck again, this time across her face. The slap wasn't just felt. It was heard, through the walls, down the hallway, and deep into the hearts of everyone watching. A reporter dropped his mic. A mother in the front row stood in shock. The principal staggered forward, unsure whether to apologize or collapse. But Adeline stood tall. No tears, no retreat, just the fire in her eyes, fierce and unforgiving. She touched her cheek only once, then turned to Caleb, lifting the boy into her arms. Cameras kept rolling. What no one knew, not even the senator himself, was that 20 years ago, when he sent away his newborn son after a scandal nearly ended his political career, he paid a distant orphanage to raise the child discreetly. The woman who stepped forward back then was none other than a fresh-faced volunteer teacher named Adeline Moore. The boy she held now, trembling from the senator's wrath, was not just any student. He was the son of the man who had just slapped her, and fate had just begun to unravel. The classroom emptied, but the air remained thick with what had just happened. Word spread like wildfire. Teachers whispered in corners. Parents started pulling their children close. Even the janitor, who usually wore headphones and avoided trouble, stood frozen behind the mop cart, eyes wide. But Miss Adeline didn't speak of the slap. She stayed behind after the bell, picking up the spilled juice, brushing Caleb's curls from his forehead, humming an old tune that had no words, only memory. She didn't know that cameras were still outside, or that the clip had already hit the internet like a hammer smashing glass. By sunset, it was trending. Hashtag slapped by power. Hashtag teacher protector. Hashtag Everbrook scandal. Back in his polished limousine, Senator Callahan laughed it off. In his world, mistakes vanished with headlines. He was already drafting a statement, something polished and hollow. I deeply regret any miscommunication. His assistant handed him a water bottle, but he tossed it aside, more annoyed by the stain on his shoe than by the bruises on a child's cheek. But one thing clawed at the back of his mind, her face. Something about the woman he slapped. Something oddly familiar. He couldn't place it. Miss Adeline, meanwhile, returned home to her small, book-filled apartment on the edge of town. It was a modest place, walls lined with photos of children she'd raised, tutored, comforted. There were no personal photos, no family frames, just students. One of them, now a young man in military uniform, wrote her letters every Christmas. And then there was Caleb. She had raised him from the moment he was dropped at the orphanage. Gates 5 years ago. No papers, no name, just a birthmark on his wrist and a folded envelope pinned to his shirt. She was the one who took him in, fed him, guided him, taught him to read and write. She was the one who stayed up nights, while he cried for parents he couldn't remember. She never told him he was abandoned. She never told anyone who left him there. But she knew. Because inside that folded envelope was a single name, typed on plain white paper with no signature. Brooks Callahan. She hadn't come forward all these years. She had no reason to. Caleb had a new life now, a good one. She thought keeping the secret would protect him. But after today's events, she knew the silence had only built a volcano, and it had just started to rumble. Outside her window, a storm gathered over Everbrook. Across town, Senator Callahan's PR team scrambled to contain the outrage. And in the shadows of that chaos, a forgotten truth stirred, one that would soon rewrite the senator's legacy, unravel a political dynasty, and place the orphan teacher at the center of a national storm. But Miss Adeline didn't fear storms. She had been born in one, and this time, she would not stay quiet. The morning after the slap, the sun rose over Everbrook like it always did, but nothing felt the same. Outside the school, news vans parked like vultures. Parents gathered at the gates. Inside her modest apartment, Miss Adeline stood by the window, holding Caleb's backpack with steady hands, her face unreadable. She had made her decision. She would take Caleb to school, walk straight through the cameras, and return to her post as if her world hadn't been shaken. Not out of pride, but because the children needed her, and because Caleb deserved normalcy even if the world refused to give it. The boy walked beside her, small hand in hers. The bruise on his cheek had faded, but its memory had not. When they reached the gates, the cameras swarmed. Microphones shoved forward. Reporters shouted her name, but she never stopped walking. Caleb didn't even flinch. It was as if he had inherited her strength. Inside the school, the principal waited, red-eyed and nervous. He had received a private call that morning from a restricted number. A calm voice warned him not to let the woman speak publicly. They offered a donation, 6 figures, tax-free. All he had to do was put Miss Adeline on leave. He hung up. Then he called the school board. But Adeline was already seated with her students, reading a story about a boy who found treasure inside a cave where others feared to enter. Her voice didn't tremble. Her hands didn't shake. She smiled when the bell rang, collected homework, and taught math with the same grace she always had. But beneath her calmness, something deeper stirred. That evening, she returned to the orphanage where Caleb had once been dropped off. She hadn't stepped foot inside in years, though her donations still kept the lights on. In the back office, a locked drawer held the envelope. She opened it again. Brooks Callahan's name glared up at her like an unfinished sentence. She stared at it a long while. Then she picked up the phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in 20 years. Across the city, inside a private home adorned with awards and political portraits, a young man, tall, clean-shaven, with the same sharp eyes as Senator Callahan, picked up the call. His name was Lucas Grant, but he didn't know that he was born Lucas Callahan. Miss Adeline didn't say who she was. She only asked to meet. Lucas paused, then agreed. The next morning, he arrived at a park bench as instructed. He wore a veteran's jacket and held a photo of the orphanage in his hand. Miss Adeline sat beside him with quiet dignity, her hair pinned back, her eyes steady. For the first time in years, she told the truth, the whole truth. That he had been left behind, that she had raised him, that he had a half-brother, that the man who slapped her yesterday was his father. Lucas didn't speak, but something in his posture shifted. And in that quiet park, as the sun broke through gray clouds, a new storm began to form, one that would shake the nation, one that would force a senator to kneel before the truth, and one that would finally crown the orphan teacher with the respect she never asked for but always deserved. Lucas didn't go home that night. He walked the streets of the city in silence, carrying 2 invisible weights, his identity, and the face of the woman who had protected him without needing credit. He stopped by the old military base where he once served, sat beneath a dim light near the gate, and replayed her words again and again. Everything that had shaped him, his drive, his compassion, his discipline, came from the woman the world had just watched being humiliated. And the man who gave him life? He had used her as a shield, then discarded her like nothing. The next morning, Lucas stood in front of the Capitol building wearing his decorated service uniform. News cameras clicked. Journalists leaned in. A press conference had been called unexpectedly, and no one knew what it was about. A podium had been set up, with a simple white cloth draped over it. At precisely 9 a.m., Lucas stepped forward and spoke for the first time. He didn't mention politics. He didn't preach. He told a a story of a young boy left at an orphanage, of a woman who chose to stay behind when others left, who taught lessons by living them, and who shielded not just bodies, but souls. He ended with this: I stand here not as a soldier, not as a political pawn, but as a son who knows the truth now. That woman you saw in the video, Miss Adeline Moore, she raised me. She gave me everything I am, and I will not let her be silenced again. The crowd went silent. Within minutes, social media exploded again, but this time not with outrage, but with reverence. Hashtag honor Adeline. Hashtag truth has a son. Hashtag teacher to a million hearts. In the senator's estate, Brooks Callahan watched the broadcast on mute. His hands trembled. His jaw clenched. He hadn't known about the older boy, Lucas. He had hidden the first child's existence to save his own image. But now, both sons were surfacing and standing taller than he ever had. But the true wound wasn't just public embarrassment. It was the quiet revelation that the woman he dismissed had, in fact, built something more powerful than politics. She had built a legacy. In Everbrook, Miss Adeline sat in her classroom during lunch break, unaware of the storm Lucas had just unleashed. She only smiled when the school librarian brought in a stack of handwritten letters from around the country, teachers, parents, soldiers, strangers, all writing to say thank you. That night, Lucas showed up at her door with a simple gift, a framed photo of her and Caleb, taken unknowingly by a journalist on the day of the slap. But this time, it wasn't a photo of pain. It was a portrait of protection. And now, the world had seen it. By the time the week ended, a congressional ethics panel had summoned Senator Brooks Callahan to answer for his actions. The slap was no longer just a scandal. It was a symbol, a moment the nation couldn't forget, no matter how many press statements his team tried to issue. It wasn't about politics anymore. It was about power misused, and one woman who didn't bow to it. The hearing was broadcast live. Viewers across the country tuned in, waiting for accountability. They didn't know that Miss Adeline had declined every interview, every camera crew, every reward offer. She still showed up to class, still carried Caleb's drawings home, still packed extra sandwiches for students who often came without lunch. But on the morning of the hearing, she received a letter. It was written in Lucas's careful handwriting. Please come, not to defend yourself, but so the truth has a face. She didn't wear anything fancy, just her usual faded cardigan and soft blue skirt. Her shoes were scuffed, but clean. When she entered the chamber, the air shifted. Everyone turned. Journalists froze. Brooks Callahan went pale. Lucas stood to escort her to the front row. The hearing began. The footage was played again. The slap, the gasp, the stillness. A senator striking a teacher. Then the questions began. Brooks tried to defend himself. I was provoked. She stepped in the way. The child longed. But no one believed him anymore. Lucas took the stand. He didn't attack. He didn't accuse. He simply told the panel who raised him, who fed him, who taught him to salute the flag and help strangers. He held up the envelope, the one that bore his father's name. He left me. She raised me. Decide for yourselves who deserves your trust. The room fell into silence. And then, the unthinkable. Brooks Callahan was removed from his post. Censured publicly. Sponsors withdrew. The university he once funded renamed their political hull, calling it instead the Adeline Moore Center for Human Dignity. But Adeline didn't cry. She didn't even smile. She walked out of the chamber, holding Caleb's hand, while Lucas walked behind them. Three people bound not by blood, but by truth. And the world finally saw what power really looked like. Not in podiums or politics, but in the quiet strength of a woman who never stopped choosing kindness. At the school gates the next morning, parents lined up, not to protest, but to thank her. Children handed her flowers. And someone whispered, she raised a senator's son, and reminded the world what real education means. But Miss Adeline didn't stay long at the celebration. She returned to her desk, opened her lesson book, and began preparing for the next day because, while the world had just learned her name, she had always known her purpose. Months passed. The media storm faded. But Miss Adeline's name didn't disappear. It planted roots. Across America, her story became a symbol in classrooms, training centers, and quiet homes where teachers held broken children together with invisible threads of hope. Scholarships were created in her name. Her old school, once falling apart, received donations from every corner of the country. The cracked windows were replaced, the peeling paint covered. But room 6B? They left that exactly as it was, Adeline's chair. Her chipped mug, even her notes on the blackboard. A small brass plaque was added to the door, where character was taught. She never asked for any of it. Instead, she focused on rebuilding the one thing that still needed healing, Caleb. The boy was growing stronger, surer of himself. He no longer flinched when voices rose. He asked questions. He started painting again. One day, he handed her a drawing, a portrait of her holding a globe made of stars. "You gave me the world," he had written at the bottom. Lucas, now working with a non-profit for foster children, visited often. He'd sit with Adeline under the oak tree behind her apartment, telling stories about his travels. He'd bring her tea and letters from soldiers who remembered her kindness. He told her one day he might run for office, not for revenge, but for reform. And Adeline only ever replied, "Just remember who you are, not whose son you are." The former Senator, Brooks Callahan, disappeared from the spotlight. Some said he left the country. Others whispered he stayed behind, living in shame. But to Adeline, he was simply another man who chose legacy over love and lost both. On a quiet spring afternoon, a knock came at the school gates. A young girl, newly hired to teach music, stood nervously holding a bouquet. She introduced herself and said she had once been in the orphanage as a toddler. Adeline had read to her when no one else would. She had no photos, no memories, just a feeling of warmth and safety when she heard Adeline's name. That day, the two of them sat in the music room, tuning a broken piano together. And just like that, another seed was planted. Adeline Moore never became famous for her speeches. She never wrote a memoir. She never shouted her pain to the world. But her life taught something deeper than any curriculum could hold. That strength lives in silence. That justice begins in classrooms. And that sometimes the greatest revolution begins with a single hand shielding a child from harm. And though she began her life orphaned and forgotten, she ended it as something far more powerful. A mother to the broken, a compass to the lost, and a teacher the world would never again overlook.